Duque Márquez, 33rd President of the Republic of Colombia, moderated by Executive Director of Global Programming and Events, Conrad Kiechel.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're extremely honored to have former President Iván Duque Márquez here with us.
Thank you so much, Conrad.
And this is going to be an entire hour devoted to climate resilience, and we're going to start with President Duque for about 20 minutes or so. And what I really want to do, as President Duque and I have discussed, is to focus, and I know this is a passion of yours, President Duque, on the human factor of climate change, climate resilience, and how we as the human race make our climate future a better one. But I wanted to start by, speaking of futures, by giving a shout out for President Duque's brand new book, Nuestro Futuro.
Thank you so much, Conrad.
And President Duque, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you really set out to do in your book?
Well, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here in this great Milken Institute event, Conrad, and thank you for your generous words. That book, Our Future, Nuestro Futuro, as it says also in the subtitle, it's a green manifesto for Latin America and the Caribbean. And what I mean with the manifesto is that it's a practical book that has clear recommendations for a region that is part of the solutions to face climate change, and how countries should embrace them, execute them, and reach two very clear objectives: the national determined contributions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. And it's all based in the idea that when you have the right leadership from the government, the private sector, and also the philanthropic sector, these things can occur. And they were all tested in the Colombian experience. So we passed from having a climate action cabinet, which we created, a climate action bill that we got approved in Congress unanimously in both chambers, the energy transition where we passed from 0.2% of our energy matrix in non-conventional renewables to 14%, getting 30% of the territory declared a protected area, mobilizing a green economy sentiment with the private sector, and I'll say something that was very important in Colombia, issue a green taxonomy that allowed us to get into the international capital markets with green bonds that had 7% greenium based on what Colombia had achieved, among many other things. So this is a way of looking to my post-presidency, not looking back, but telling the people these things can occur. And if the countries decide to embrace those 16 principles, I think Latin America will be part of the solution.
I want to get into your thoughts about not just the state of the world in this week of COP, also Latin America, but even to back it up a little bit before that. President Duque, you spoke about your actions, very impressive actions during your presidency. If you could roll the tape back as you began your presidency and even before then, how did you come into the climate, into your passion and championship for it? I mean, obviously, Colombia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. You're at the spear point, if you will, of climate change. So tell us a little bit about how you personally.
Well, I've shared this experience in different to different audiences, but it all comes to my father and my mother. And actually, this book, Nuestro Futuro, is dedicated to my mother, because since we were kids with my brother Andres, our mother always told us how important was nature. And I remember that at some point when I was around 6, 7 years old, my father was the president of the Bogotá Water and Sanitation Company. And Bogotá is a city that is located 2,600 meters above sea level. And basically 80% of Bogotá water comes from a high altitude ecosystem, which is a páramo called Chingaza. So our mother took us to Chingaza, and she always taught us about nature. And there's this beautiful tree that is an endemic species where Colombia has almost 90% of all that same species called frailejones, which is a beautiful tree, doesn't grow more than this, but what it does, it is a water regulator. It absorbs the water from the soil, and it administers the way back of the water so that it goes to the rivers, and it is able to provide 80% of the water to a 9 million people city. So those sensibility contacts with nature were very important. And my father as well was always telling us why we have to protect the rivers, why do we have to protect the trees, and what the trees represent for a country that is 35% Amazonic land. So that grew as a passion. And I have to say that since I was in high school, I started being an environmental activist. I remember in 1992, when we had the whole World Environmental Summit, I was one of the leaders inside school trying to promote saving the earth. And I remember that Mario Molina, the former Nobel Peace Prize winner in chemistry, who was very prominent because of all his achievements and discoveries on the fragility of the ozone layer, he was one of the persons that visited Colombia, and since I was 15 years old, I became a friend with him. So those are moments that I always kept in my life, and in every single professional stage I've been involved in, the environment has been one of the most important things.
That's wonderful, and thank you for that lifelong passion and support. So, President Duque, let's shift a little bit to Latin America. You know, as you said, the subtitle of your book is especially about Latin America and the Caribbean. You were a leader of an important regional power in your presidency. How would you assess what's going on within South America, Latin America now?
So that's a great question, Conrad, because I remember that I was invited one day to a conference, and I said, you know, where are the seats for the superpowers of biodiversity? And people said, what are you talking about? And people don't tend to see that if you saw, for example, biodiversity as one of the most important strategic assets in the planet, Colombia will be like what Saudi Arabia is to oil. Right. Colombia is the second most biodiverse country per unit of territory, and maybe is the most biodiverse country in the world, along with Brazil. And that just makes us realize that we have this treasure in a region that has 40% of the world's biodiversity. And also in a region where climate change is producing very negative effects. 13 of the most vulnerable countries in the world to the effects of climate change are in Latin America. And Latin America barely represents 8% of the emissions. And when you look at the whole region, 47% of our emissions come from deforestation and negative use of land. The Amazon has lost the equivalent of the size in Germany and France together in the last 40 years. And if we continue that pattern, before the end of this decade, the Amazon will become a net emitter and a contention wall. So we have to act rapidly, boldly, and we have to put a concept together, which is market-driven, nature-based solutions. And why I say market-driven is because we definitely need to create a sustainable way of income for local communities, rural communities, indigenous communities, so that they no longer have the temptation of going to the illegal economies that are affecting the Amazon, and then protect such a very important treasure for the world. And I'll say this, Conrad, we can do everything good in terms of climate action in the Western Hemisphere. But if we don't solve the situation in the Amazon, by 2030, we will not achieve absolutely anything. So this is not just a matter of willingness, this is a moral duty to protect this very important ecosystem.
So, President, let's shift now to COP right after that. You've been here for a good chunk of this last week while COP has been in session. I know you've been very active, not just in this COP, but you're kind of a COP veteran. How would you assess this COP, bad COP, good COP, so-so COP?
You know, I actually used that line this week because as long as you're participating in COPs, you become a veteran in all these panels of discussion. But I'll say COP28 has been a good COP. Okay. And it has been a good COP for very particular reasons. One, I think the loss and damage fund that was announced, great announcement, great step. Now, as you well know, the devil is in the details. What we all expect out of this fund is that the fund is able to deploy capital at a very fast pace. And the reason why I consider this is so strategic is because I've been participating in panels about carbon pricing. Right. And my first concern is that the discussion on carbon pricing is pretty much centered in the global north. And the emerging economies are being left behind. And why is this worrying? Because the global south has been the most affected region in the planet due to the externalities of all the damage that has been produced over time. So if people are going to talk about a global carbon tax, there has to be part of that carbon tax collection that has to be deployed to the global south to compensate past externalities. And if you're going to use trading mechanisms, the ETS as we know them, they have to allow to bring projects from abroad in order to count so that we can bring interesting projects from the global south. And I also mentioned this talking about Africa. Africa needs to invest $1.8 trillion to meet their NDCs in the next 7 years. And there's no fiscal space for that investment to come from the public sector. Philanthropy doesn't have $1.8 trillion to be deployed only in Africa. So the market-driven nature-based mechanism has to be through carbon credits or biodiversity credits, guaranteeing the integrity, the transparency, the trustworthiness, but it's the only way we're going to massively deploy capital. So I think that's something that has to be put into consideration when you talk about the loss and damage fund and the other mechanism. And I'll say the other good news, which I think was a very important statement from the UAE, was the 30 billion fund. Because it's real money, the money's there, and they want to get it deployed. So I think those were very important announcements. And I have to finish by saying that the private sector has been able to bring a great amount of CEOs to this COP and demonstrate the compromise that they have for the companies, that they have with the externalities they produce in the planet. And I believe COP28 is going to be remembered as a private sector-led COP in terms of the announcements that we have seen so far.
That's one of the things I wanted to get your views on, and you've just expressed them perfectly, which is that it seems like this COP, from the leadership on down, there's been more acceptance of the fact that the private sector and private companies around the world have to be part of the solutions. It can't just be a policy-focused discussion. So that's great to hear. President Duque, I know you're a veteran. You've spent time at the Inter-American Development Bank. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the role of multinational development banks in terms of providing and helping with some of these financial?
So one of the big challenges, and it's also addressed in the book, is climate finance.
Yeah.
Because the IMF issues a report quite frequently on debt to GDP ratios around the world. And the world average of debt to GDP ratio that we have today is more than 90%, which tells you how limited is the fiscal space in order to massively mobilize capital for climate action. So you need to be innovative, you need to be fast, and you need to be bold. So I think the three elements that are required are, for highly indebted poor countries, you need to accelerate a debt for climate action swap so that you can swap some of the debt that you have with the multilaterals, and it is aligned with meeting some of the climate action targets. The second thing is, in some countries that are good performers in the way they manage their fiscal policy, you have to, with the IMF support, allowed to have special purpose vehicles to be invested in climate action and not to be counted on the regular fiscal debt calculation. Why? Because you need to have an extraordinary investment. And why is extraordinary? Because if you invest today, it's to prevent further pressure on your fiscal accounts in the future. And another thing that is happening is cities and local governments. Most of the climate problems we're facing have to be addressed at the city level or at the regional government levels. And every single time a mayor or a governor wants to look for long-term finances in the Global South, they have to request a guarantee from the national government, and those guarantees are accounted as if it were a loan. So they clash with the fiscal space capacity. So creating guarantee funds for the local government's climate action policies, it's also crucial. And last but not least, I definitely believe that ETF mechanisms that can unite the way the market thinks with the right causes to confront some of the effects of the climate crisis is something that has to be very well thought and applied in the Global South.
Okay. President Duque, I know we only have a few more minutes left. There are so many more questions I'd love to get into, but I'm going to focus on just a couple because I know I really want to make sure that people get the insight from you on these. This morning in your session that you were joined with Mike Milken, you mentioned the abbreviation or acronym CCT, which is, as I recall, climate, conflict, and technology, right? You also spoke about one of the kind of really not well-known facts these days, not related necessarily to climate, which is the tech scene in Latin America is actually very flourishing and innovative. But more broadly, or more globally, do you think there's a way that technology can help address climate and thus reduce conflict?
So technology can be a very important tool to create trustworthiness, data analytics, and data confidence when it comes to the carbon credit market, and also to clearly monitor the right level of carbon capturing of a specific zones where you have deployed investment for that purpose. I also believe technology is going to be very important to have the climate risk assessments that we require in order to determine what will happen to the value of assets in the future. There are many cities in the Western Hemisphere that are endangered by the rise in sea levels or by the increasing level of hurricane category 5 due to the heat and the confrontation of currents. So those analytics are crucial because you might be seated in an asset that 10 years down the road will have significant less value. So having an assessment of those risks and knowing what those risks cost is also very important when it comes to climate action. But I also believe satellite technology is going to be essential, for example, to fight against illegal mining, where we're seeing a great part of the Amazon being destructed. So this will allow us to identify which yellow machinery is there, trace where that yellow machinery came from, and also I think the next challenge is how, through technology, we can make them unoperational. So yes, I believe there are many uses of technology, but I just give you some of the ideas that I have thought that could be applied and that actually the private sector is thinking on how to apply them.
Perfect. Before my last question, I do want to raise something that's not necessarily climate related, but it is very much in the news, at least in our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. And that is what's happening with Venezuela and specifically what's been happening the last few weeks, even the last few days, with the, what would we call it, a referendum that was held about possibility of encroaching on sovereign space in Guyana. I'm not sure how many people in this region have really focused on that, but it is something that's very newsworthy, and I'd just love to have your views on that.
It's a very important question, Conrad, because Guyana is a country that has basically a size almost similar to Ecuador, with an 800,000 people population, and it is seated in a reservoir of oil of more than 11 billion barrels of oil. And most of them are offshore, but there are also onshore assets to be identified. And they have a region that is called the Essequibo, which is the equivalent of 40% of the size of that country. And for a long time, there has been a dispute with Venezuela, but the fact is that Guyana has exercised sovereignty in the Essequibo for the last 100 years or so. And all of a sudden, a dispute that was supposed to be managed in the International Court of Justice was tried to be solved in a brutal way by Nicolas Maduro, who's the dictator that runs Venezuela, because he said, okay, let's take the Exequibo, so let's take 40% of the control of Guyana. So he called a referendum with a biased electoral system where a minority of people voted, and next day he comes and says, well, now this is the new map of Venezuela. And next day he comes and says, okay, I'm asking all the officials to start granting rights of oil exploration in the Essequibo region. And yesterday, President Ali from Guyana gave a marvelous speech telling his people, we're going to defend our sovereignty with all our energy. And why this is so worrying is because it's the same pattern that Vladimir Putin had with Ukraine. Same pattern. In this case, it's also a dictatorship trying to invade the territory of a smaller country that is a democracy. And I just don't understand why there has been such a silence from the European Union, such a silence from the UN Security Council, and maybe why there hasn't been a categorical statement from the United States government, because actually what Maduro is doing, he's violating the UN Charter. He's violating the Democratic Charter of the Americas, and I think we have to put a lot of attention, and we have to put all the pressure possible so that we don't see a bloodbath triggered by the desperate dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro.
Thank you, President, and it is truly reprehensible.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm going to let one last question. Again, going back to the title of the President's book, Nuestro Futuro, what do you, and you spoke very movingly about your father and your mother earlier, you have children. What do you think of their children, of their future in the climate world of, let's say, 2050?
Well, you asked me a question this morning, Conrad, and I think we have to be very hard with ourselves in terms of asking, what is it that we're leaving the new generations? And I think the new generation can't be the ones who will suffer all the climate crisis because we were unable to stabilize the weather at 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think we definitely have to do that, and it is a must. But we also have to build in their hearts and minds the idea that they have to be also biodiverse citizens, which are citizens that in their own ethics have a clear idea on how to reduce our individual carbon footprint. Yeah. So we try to create that with our children, and every single day when I have the opportunity to chat with them, I feel happy that they have an environmental conscience, and they're also part of the dedication of this book with my wife, Maria Juliana. But when I think of the kids all over the world, I just believe that we have to be not cynical, and we have to be honest and try to put as much energy as we can so that maybe by COP30 in Brazil, in Pará, we have two very clear targets. Definitely to have all the investment mobilization needed so that we stabilize the Earth climate at 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that we're able to do one big thing for the Americas, which is to mobilize all our ingenuity to have zero deforestation in Latin America and the Caribbean before 2030. If that is met, we will solve 50% of the problem related to climate in Latin America. And Latin America, just with that decision, will be able to meet their NDCs in 2030. So that's a moral goal that we have to achieve.
Thank you for ending on that very hopeful note, President. Thank you
so much.
Please join me in thanking the President.
It's been a pleasure.
No matter where we're born,